Hello and welcome to our amazing story of a Scottish missionary who gave up his life for the gospel and a Retford widow who swapped a comfortable life in Nottinghamshire in exchange for mission to one of the most challenging places imaginable, the cannibal lands of New Guinea. My name is Adrian Gray and I'm historical advisor to Pilgrims and Prophets Christian Heritage Tours, which is based in Retford, Nottinghamshire. We aim to get people interested in amazing stories about people from our part of the world. In this video, we are going to look at the Scottish missionary James Chalmers and his second wife Lizzie, who came from Retford. We are going to look at the extraordinary story of how a middle-aged widow from Retford married a famous missionary and abandoned a comfortable life for the wilds of Papua New Guinea, which was then still infested with cannibals. Though she is best known as Lizzie Chalmers, the life of this brave woman actually began as Sarah Eliza Large. She was born in Leeds in 1847, the early days of Queen Victoria. Her mother had to make ends meet by taking in a lodger, and so Jane Hercus, a schoolteacher from a Scottish Presbyterian background, came to live with them. Jane came from Thurso, at the far northern tip of the Scottish mainland. She and Lizzie became quite friendly, but in 1865 Jane married a Scottish missionary and so had to move away. This man was James Chalmers. James Chalmers had been born at Ardrishaig in Argyll in 1841. This was a remote Scottish village at the entrance to the Crinan Canal, which had opened in 1801. Chalmers grew up beside Loch Fyne, and boats were part of his childhood. He went to Glenarray School, which is now a ruin. He had lots of adventures and once was involved in a dramatic rescue from a flooded river. When he was 15, he was stirred by stories of missionaries to Fiji and the cannibals they had encountered. The stories were read to him at the Inverary Presbyterian Sunday School by Robert Michael. Michael had then wondered aloud whether anyone in the class might one day go out as a missionary as well. However, Chalmers was not actually converted himself until the age of 18, when he was involved in the Argyll revival. James was living at Inverary and working as a lawyer's clerk when some evangelists preached in the town. There he had maintained his family links with the Presbyterian Church. He later described what happened like this. I was pierced through and through with conviction of sin and felt lost beyond all hope of salvation. On the Monday, Mr. Michael, that was the minister, came to my help. As he quoted, "The blood of Jesus Christ, his Son, cleanses us from all sin," I felt that salvation was possible for me, and some glorious gladness came into my heart. After a time, light increased, and I felt that God was speaking to me in his word, and I believed unto salvation. We also have an independent witness's view of this event. One night, the news came to Mr. Michael that James Chalmers was in the street crying aloud for mercy, this witness wrote. Through the crisis, he was wisely guided by his minister, and then the lawyer's clerk, happy in the grace of salvation, began to devote his free hours to incessant evangelistic work in the town and the neighbourhood. His heart was in such work. After his conversion, Chalmers decided to work as an evangelist. He joined the Glasgow City Mission. There he met George Turner, who had been a missionary in Samoa and was inspired by him. Chalmers then re-evaluated his life and decided he also wanted to be a missionary in Samoa. He got in touch with the London Missionary Society, which was a non-denominational society suitable for a man from a Presbyterian background. They arranged for him to train at Cheshunt College near London. James and Jane married in autumn 1865 when he had completed his training. 2 days later, he was ordained into the ministry. He was appointed to go to Rarotonga in the Cook Islands, and they left in January 1866 for the long journey to these Pacific islands. After a 3-month stay in Australia, they sailed for what is now Vanuatu, but they hit a rock and had to go back for repairs. When they sailed again, the ship was nearly wrecked, so it took them 15 months to reach their destination. The most famous of the ships they used was called the John Williams, named after the earlier missionary. This ship struck a reef in January 1867 as they were trying to land, and they nearly were drowned. Well, let's not forget Lizzie. Lizzie had met a Retford businessman, Thomas Harrison, and had got married to him. He was described as a very excellent Christian gentleman. Retford was a busy little market town, and Lizzie moved into a comfortable new house on the outskirts of the town called Alton House. We think that Mr. Harrison's job was mainly as an agricultural contractor. We managed to identify which was their house from old plans stored at the Bassetlaw Museum. It's one of the few things to actually have the name of the house on it. Lizzie was well off enough not to need to work, and in the 1881 census she was described as a housekeeper. Rarotonga was not really what Chalmers wanted. It had already been evangelised, whereas he wanted to make new converts. John Williams had brought the gospel here in the 1830s. Chalmers had thought carefully about how the world was changing. He feared that new territories would be exploited and corrupted by Europeans unless he could first bring them the gospel and develop a local leadership. They must act for themselves, he wrote. Unless the natives are taught to look after their own island and prepare for the future, they will not be able to resist the pressure of the white faces. So Chalmers was a little frustrated during his time at Rarotonga, but he was popular with local people and built relationships. They started to call him Tamate, a name which he was always known by forevermore. Cultural clashes had often caused problems with missionaries, but Chalmers was more informal. He ate like the locals, dressed a little bit differently, and actually continued to like a drop of whiskey at this stage of his life. It was said that his friendships, especially with the local people, were powerful and lasting. But he also knew that going into new lands like New Guinea would be dangerous, including for his wife Jane if he took her. John Williams had been killed there in 1839. So in 1877, Chalmers moved with Jane to New Guinea, starting in the relative safety of Port Moresby and Sewell. A mission had been established at Port Moresby in 1874, but there was still a huge area of the whole island untouched. They soon built a house at Sewell. James and Jane had got to get used to a culture which had practiced cannibalism for centuries. They actually lived in villages surrounded by human skulls. When Jane was ill, villagers kindly offered her a meal to help her recover of human flesh. Chalmers was offered a second wife. Otherwise, they relied on tinned food, which local people found fascinating. However, Chalmers, now usually called Tamate, at least had a base from which he could develop his main work, which was to travel into remote areas, bring the gospel, and set up a network of mission stations from which to reach other areas. Meanwhile, Jane was often left to deal with a common problem, fights between different groups. Despite it being dangerous and unpredictable territory, Chalmers never carried any form of weapon. We know from the letters that Jane wrote to him that his normal approach was to simply walk into a village and show his empty hands. He said that, "My plan for a first visit is to arrive, make friends and get away again before the people realise what has happened." A friend described his method. Smarty would make signs of peace, distribute presents and make a brief address, stating that he had come to make friends and planned to return for a longer visit in order to tell them of a great being of whom they were ignorant. He felt that the first visit should be short, just long enough to establish amiable relations. Fighting was going on all around, so Chalmers said that we preach the gospel in many ways. One of our best at present is making peace between tribes. On several occasions he left Jane for weeks at a time. Mrs. Chalmers said that it was well I remained, as the natives saw we had confidence in them, and the day following our departure they were saying amongst themselves, "They trust us, we must treat them kindly. They cannot mean us harm, or Tamati would not have left his wife behind." A colleague wrote about Chalmers's personal impact. Tamati's power over savages was partly a personal thing. It was in his presence, his carriage, his eye, his voice. It was not only wild men whom he fascinated. There was something almost hypnotic about him. Then again, his judgment, largely the result of wide experience in critical situations, was unerring. He saw evil brooding where an inexperienced eye would have seen nothing to fear. He was equally certain everything was satisfactory when a novice would have suspected danger. His fearlessness must have been a great factor of success in his hazardous work. He disarmed men by boldly going amongst them unarmed. Sadly, the climate was debilitating for Jane. In fact, some missionary societies decided that women should not accompany their husbands as the death rate was so high. Jane returned to Australia, where she died in early 1879. The obituary noted her personal heroism during the affair of the ship Myri, when Europeans had opened fire on local people. On another occasion, she had stayed on her own for a month while Chalmers went to Thursday Island for stores. Sadly, in the end, fever got her. Later, even Chalmers himself argued that young wives should not go on missions due to how few of them survived for long. The situation in New Guinea was always dangerous due to fights between the various tribes, and quite often there was further trouble provoked by Europeans. In 1881, there was an incident when 10 of the teachers from the other islands, trained by Chalmers, were killed and eaten. The British government took this as an affront and typically sent a gunboat to enforce imperial control. Chalmers, as a man caught in the middle, suddenly received attention. Yet his slow process of building relationships meant he had little to show for his time at this point. The Times reported how he'd said that after years of work he'd never made a single Christian convert in New Guinea. The reporter wrote that all he hopes is that the germs of civilization planted in the present generation may someday render future ones capable of receiving the teaching of the gospel. This account was not quite fair, as converts were made and the gospel did establish a foothold. In fact, as we shall see, New Guinea became one of the most Christian countries in the world. Meanwhile, more teachers were trained using people from other islands, and they were brought over to New Guinea to replace those who died. Here are some in 1882, arriving on the missionary ship, the John Williams. Chalmers's views on empire are complex for us to understand today. Chalmers believed that the sinful nature of mankind was the same, whether the skin was black or white. He saw the local tribes killing each other and knew that white commercial interests would not value their lives either. So he wrote, "It is to be hoped the country is not to become part of the Australian colonies, a labour land, and a land where loose money in the hands of a few capitalists is to enter in and make enormous fortunes, sacrificing the natives and everything else. They need a strong, friendly and just power over them to save them from themselves and from the white man, whose gods are gold and land, and to whom the black man is a nuisance to be got rid of as soon as possible. He believed Britain should annex the islands, but said this was for humanitarian reasons. No one could ever make a profit from such a venture. So Chalmers's relationship with the politics at the time was complicated. He saw the spread of European influence as inevitable and wanted to help protect people in New Guinea from it. He supported the creation of a British protectorate in November 1884, but for him this was not simply an imperialistic step. He was very concerned about the exploitation of people as cheap labour for Australians, for example, and also about how they were open to be exploited generally. He hoped that having an official protection from the British government would support a policy of New Guinea for the New Guineans. In fact, he became the expert on New Guinea and began writing Work and Adventure in New Guinea, published in 1885, and Pioneering in New Guinea in 1887. Amongst the first books to show local people positively. His writing helped to make him well known at home. Chalmers opposed the exploitation of one group of people by another. He was worried that as New Guinea became accessible, its people and resources would be ravaged by others for profit. He was especially concerned about informal exploitation by Australian commercial interests, including the practice of getting New Guinea people to go to Australia, where they became almost slave labour. He thought that only the British colonial forces and their legal system could prevent this happening. One way of dealing with this as well was to develop the local leadership. In 1888, he recorded this interesting example. A New Guinean, preaching last Wednesday, said, "The time has come for us to be up and doing. Foreigners have brought us the gospel. Many have died of fever. Several have been speared and tomahawked. Now let us carry the gospel to other districts. And if we die, 'tis well, for we die in Christ. If we are murdered, 'tis well. 'Tis in carrying his name and love, and 'twill be for him. Motto, let us do it. He knows a little, so very little, yet he loves and is willing to endure for Christ," Tomate wrote. "I saved the lad a few years ago from being attacked, but was murdered by his own people." So here's the evidence of Chalmers developing people out of a heathen lifestyle into being Christian leaders of the future. Chalmers's books were so successful that news of them even reached Retford, where Lizzie Harrison heard about his book in 1885. She was able to get in touch with him. Chalmers came back to Britain the next year on a fundraising tour and to make people aware of the needs of New Guinea. He was already well known as the bearded frontier evangelist, so it must have been quite a day when he called in to visit the Harrison family at their comfortable home in Alma Road. This social stop was probably a relief. Like most missionaries, Chalmers disliked the endless meetings where you had to inspire the people into giving money. He described it as the telling of excited painted tales, lying reports and salted statistics. Well, let's hope the lies were not too numerous. Then he went off to Scotland, but while there he heard Mr. Harrison had died. On his way back south, he called in again to comfort the grieving widow, and their relationship took on a new depth. They stayed in touch, and later he wrote from the other side of the world and asked her to marry him. This meant that Lizzie would have to abandon everything to follow her new love, but she would also find her mission in life. Chalmers's strictures on young wives did not apply. She was not that young anymore. In 1888, Lizzie said goodbye to Retford forever and set off to Australia, where Chalmers came to meet her. Canon Taylor took their wedding at Cooktown. Then they sailed to Port Moresby, and from there to Motu. Their house there was pretty well on the beach, with waves washing up to the fence, but her life was not to prove quite as idyllic as that may sound. Lizzie may have looked to see where New Guinea was on a map, and she probably read a little bit about what conditions there were like. However, it remained an extremely difficult place to get to, with most travellers arriving via the, comparatively civilised Port Moresby. Well, we know what Lizzie thought of her new home because a lot of her letters have survived. Here is one of her comments. "The Marty thinks it is a delightful place," she reported. "I am not quite so much in love with it." She found that Port Moresby was an expensive place to stay. She noted that you could hardly buy any food except in tins, plus the occasional piece of wallaby. Later on, she described the houses they had to live in. "The walls are of very roughly sawn planks, which overlap each other, so that inside there are ledges innumerable from floor to thatch, every ledge being a nice accommodation for all kinds of insect life. I should think this house is 50 feet long and divided into 3 rooms. Partitions are the height of the outer walls only and leave the very high pointed thatched roof open from end to end." Chalmers was an experienced traveller, and of course he was critical of other missionaries who stayed in Port Moresby. He preferred what he called the strangely wonderful charm of taking the gospel to new places. He was used to travelling around. One trip he visited 90 villages, and sometimes he used a small steamboat. But travel between places was dangerous, and this was all new to Lizzie. He had to explain to her the great risks that occurred in trying to get from the ship onto the beach in a small boat. He said, "Now, Lizzie, in a surf like this, the boat, if she goes at all, will turn right over. So do not cling to it, but keep clear of it if possible. The boys and everyone will think first of you, and if we get ashore alive, never mind if all goes. The anchor will fall out and keep the boat." I wonder if she was quite as blasé about it as he was. Well, in 1891, he was shipwrecked again off Cape Bedford, this time from the missionary ship Harrier. On these journeys, Chalmers often left Lizzie at the mission station. She badly missed having friends of her own culture. "If I stop to think," she wrote, "I feel I can't live another day in this loneliness." But when she was expecting Chalmers back, she wrote, "she was more unsettled and fidgety than if I expected a young lover." We have lots of information about Lizzie's life at Saguane. She wrote that she faced loneliness and fever and watched the destruction of all the things I treasured as the reminders of my English home. She continued, "At night, bats fly in between the walls and roof. Ants and mosquitoes also abound. If you look down on the mats and floors, you perceive they are covered with life. Even this paper is continually covered with tiny moving things, which I blow off as I write. There are about 3,000 wild savages here, fine, handsome men got up in truly savage style. I do believe I would rather face a crowd of them than the insects in this house." Well, for comfort, she had a portable piano and 6 chairs, so she did have some of the basics. On his travels, Chalmers shared a boat journey with the famous Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson, who was travelling with his wife. He toured the Pacific and Polynesia extensively in the late 1880s, at the time when the Chalmerses were in New Guinea. They became good friends on the boat journey and agreed to meet again, but it was never possible. Instead, Stevenson recommended Chalmers' books to his friends and said they were rather better than those by the famous preacher Spurgeon. Stevenson observed that it was a shame he had not met Chalmers when he was younger, otherwise his religious opinions might have turned out rather differently. Stevenson actually died in Samoa in 1894. Chalmers made his final visit to the UK in 1894 to 5. With his homespun eloquence and intense conviction, he inspired a whole generation of missionaries from pulpits and platforms of town halls. Among those who responded to his appeal for New Guinea were James Cullen, Will Saville, Reginald Bartlett and Oliver Tompkins, who was to be a significant part of his story. However, he still hated these missionary tours, writing, "Hearing myself talk was simply rushing myself into a lunatic asylum." In October 1895, Chalmers returned to Retford and delivered a farewell address at the evening service. He spoke in Retford's Congregational Church, which sadly has now been closed and is a supermarket. What would Chalmers have made of that? Lizzie never returned to Retford. She had been ill for 14 weeks, Tomarty wrote in 1900, and had suffered much. During these weeks, her faith strengthened, her love increased, and her desire to depart and be with Christ intensified. One of her last sayings was, "Jesus is near," and again, "Jesus is very near." She was conscious nearly to the end. In fact, Lizzie died on board the mission's own boat. She prayed that she might be buried on Daru and not at Sogwane, and actually her desire was granted. Chalmers wrote later, "She was a good, true, loving wife, a faithful, earnest follower of Christ, blithe and hearty, and seldom looked on life's dark side. She had a wonderful knack of making herself at home and of making friends." After her death, he mourned the loss acutely. "I feel at sea," he wrote, "a kind of wanderer. I return to the Fly River and to work. Pray for me, that more of Christ be revealed in me and through me." By this stage, their efforts had created 26 preaching stations along the Fly River. He could not have done this without Lizzie's support. Busying himself with work, Chalmers planned a trip to the Aird River Delta with one of his new recruits, Oliver Tompkins. They reached Risk Point off Tapima in April 1901. Local people came on board their boat and things got difficult. To calm things down, Chalmers and Tompkins agreed to go ashore with the people for the night, accompanied by a few of their friends from other islands. That was the last time the friends on the boat saw them alive. They waited on the boat, and the following morning nobody returned. It was discovered later that the whole party had been struck down with clubs, beheaded, and all of their bodies had been eaten with sago. Both Europeans and the more local people suffered the same fate. A friend later wrote about Chalmers, "Hitherto God had preserved him. Now he allowed the blow to fall, and his faithful servant to be called up home." Later, an expedition was sent to find what had happened. It was reported that no remains of the bodies could be found, though we searched diligently for them, but we found Tomarty's hat and pieces of the smashed boat. Nonetheless, the funeral was held. One local trader said, "I would walk 100 miles to church to do honour to the memory of Tomarty." Eventually, a memorial was erected at the place where Chalmers and Tompkins had died. Now there's even a portrait of him at the Sir Hubert Murray Stadium. However, his real memorial was that churches started to be built all over the country. It would have been typical if the British government had responded to the murders by sending a gunboat. But Chalmers' friend William Laws argued that only love would bring the gospel to the darkest corners of New Guinea. The death of Chalmers and Tompkins inspired many others to come and continue their work. However, attempts by Australian officials to bring the murderers to justice only caused more problems and several more deaths. Chalmers' life had continued to inspire people ever since. Many books have been written about him, of which a good number were handed out as Sunday school prizes. Plenty of these are still available today, online and physically. Meanwhile, Chalmers has not been forgotten in Papua New Guinea. He is celebrated by local churches as the man who laid down his life to bring them the gospel. Today, the vast majority of people in this nation, 95% or more, identify as Christian. Rather more, in fact, than in Chalmers' native Scotland, it must be said. In fact, it is one of the highest percentages in the world. Thank you for watching the story of James Chalmers and the two women who supported him in bringing the gospel to New Guinea. The sacrifice that they made is an inspiration to all of us. If you've enjoyed this story, you might like to find out more about great Christian lives from our part of England. Two of the books that we sell full of these stories are shown here on this slide, and you can order these from the website of Bookworm Retford or any other bookshop or other online retailer. Meanwhile, thank you for watching this story of James and Lizzie Chalmers.